what are maybe some historians, what is their explanation? What explanations do they give for why you have this sort of very identifiable phase in European history and in the history of the church? So before we launch into that, though, Lenny, do you want to give any initial reflections of what you've researched so far on this
Well,
topic?
interestingly, what happens here is, I think some of it is you have to put it in historical context. Why now? Why this point in time? We have to remember that, it was right after the Reformation took hold, right? This is the first breakthrough of individuals who are untethered from the Roman Church. And one of the things that they were doing was, first of all, they were availing themselves of Scripture. They were reading for themselves. The Scripture was starting to show up in the vernacular. Martin Luther, for example, had translated the New Testament into German. And you have a lot of people and pastors who were not part of the official Roman structure now reading things like Jesus casting demons out of individuals. Yeah. And this opens up kind of a new world to them, because now they're getting information that isn't necessarily filtered through the power structure of Rome. And you have to remember, Rome had a ongoing viable interest in keeping things calm and showing that they are in control. Doesn't mean that Rome didn't believe in demonic possession or things like that. They actually did, and they had ways and formats to approach this. But now you're starting to see a lot of independent entities reflecting on these things too, and some are more thoughtful and studious than others. So, and that is true today. The first thing I think we want to emphasize is these guys coming into this, although they're coming into a new kind of ideology in terms of their theology, they, first of all, lived in an enchanted world. They saw the world as bigger than them. They saw and believed that things like angels and demons were real. Now, we de-emphasize that today. We eschew that, and maybe we're wrong in doing so as well, because the New Testament clearly seems to teach that demons and angels and have effect on human persons. So while we dismiss that and think that any prior historical understandings that seem odd to us are based in ignorance, I just want to be careful that we understand the context in which we're talking about, that you're talking about people who, like I said, had come out of Rome, and maybe Rome didn't publicize these kinds of demonic issues nearly at length. And if somebody was found, they were quick to quell them. But beyond that, you also had folks who were trying to work this through in an era where angels and demons were truly to be feared, because they recognized their power and their persistence. And it's not that anything we can't explain is an angel or a demon, but it is an enchanted world in which they're trying to do the best they can.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can take that into account, that there's a greater general credence to the supernatural, and it's permeating the everyday world, which we might argue, and we have had recently, that seems to, we might be making a shift back towards a more religious and more supernatural kind of thinking about the world we live in, even today in our contemporary existence. But yeah, okay, we take that for granted. I mean, in my research, I would say though, like, even prior to, while it's true that between 1550 and 1660, these are the years that one researcher gives as sort of the height of the persecution of witches the finding and persecution of supposed witches. You do have in the earlier Middle Ages, so in the 8th, 9th, and then 10th centuries, there wasn't a lot of theological engagement with demonism, with occult, with magic. We can presuppose and assume, I think rightly, that there was always a remnant paganism. You think for several hundred years, pagans and Christians lived relatively side by side, in late antiquity. Even after Constantine, you get, a couple hundred years there before Europe really becomes a Christian society. There's the slow migration of peoples, the extension of the gospel into, tribal lands and the far throes of the Roman Empire. But, it's interesting. One of the earliest documents that we have that speaks specifically to like magic use, what later then would be called witchcraft, is this the Canon Episcopi, which was a collection of theological writings of the Church Fathers and everything, conducted in the early 900s. And it's a much more restrained document as far as like, what demons do and what the punishments should be for people who are involved in maybe invoking spirits or in magic use. So a lot of historians would call it a fairly rational sort of approach to, magic use, witchcraft, demonism, where the punishments are like, it's not that they're, people aren't being declared heretics, but they're not being executed. What is being proposed is sort of like censuring of people as sort of disciplinary sort of things, but not outright execution or torture or execution. So these earlier documents, as opposed to what comes starting more in the what we call maybe the High Middle Ages, the late 14th and early 15th centuries, are a little more restrained in their approach to demonology. What we might call demonology is a locus of theology. And it may just be because it wasn't really the focus of the church until later. I mean, theology develops. Right?
Yeah, well, and one of the interesting things here that one of the jumps I think that happened that kind of really kicks this off is there is an assumption that witches can basically summon and project demons onto others and afflict others. So biblically, we don't ever see this. We never see the fact that a human being is controlling or conjuring a demon to go after one's enemies, for example. The closest thing we ever come to any kind of conjuring that actually works is the 1 Samuel 25, The Witch of Endor.
Right.
And even there, when King Saul goes to this, basically this medium in order to bring up the spirit of Samuel, the prophet, he pays the medium and she goes through her shtick. But when Samuel actually appears, she was surprised. She didn't even think that was supposed to work, right? Because it's God who is in control of the living and the dead. And Samuel rebukes Saul for even attempting this kind of thing and says, your days are numbered. So, but the idea then had, for some reason, at this point in time that you're talking about, it had morphed. In prior to, you could have demon possession, but we saw that as, and Jesus taught, if a person even has a demon cast out of him and he does nothing, then the demon will of his own volition come bring 7 more in and possess the person. The last state of the individual would be worse than the first. But that seems to be contingent upon the demon himself and maybe the individual opening the door for that type of arrangement. Any kind of occultic activity means that you yourself are opening your door up to possession. But to say that as a witch or a necromancer or whomever, that you can summon a demon and say, go after person Y and afflict them, that was a new idea. And one of the reasons why I think, it turned people's fear meters way up. Oh, am I having all this string of bad luck because someone has set a demon upon me? And secondly, it allowed those who would hold to that view and believe that this witch was not simply bucking Christian principles and opening themselves up to demon possession, but also afflicting others and causing others pain. And then that's when you say, well, we're going to burn you at the stake because you're a danger to society.
Yeah, and I think that's true. I would want to tease apart a couple things there because, so let me put it this way: historians will look back and they've tried to come up with what are some of the causes for this emergence of a more radical anti movement against supposed witchcraft and witchery in Europe, right? And one theory obviously would just say, well, look, there's remnant paganism left in the land, so that's there, and the Bible does speak about demons, and at some point you get a development of theology and theological thinking about the supernatural realm, about the demonic and how it works, and of course this gets turned into more formal heresies, right? So there's the emergence of theological doctrines, which then obviously any a supposed practice of magic or this or pagan magic, which would be like things that maybe were carryovers from Roman antiquity, right? So these would be now interpreted through the lens of Scripture, right? This is not just pagan worship of Demeter or Ceres or Athena or whatever, but this is sort of more directly related to Satan, right? To the biblical conception of the arch, anti-God, right? So it morphs into sort of like more direct sort of Satanism, right? Which then gets construed as like the arch heresy that the church goes after.
I think we see a parallel in like hoodoo, for example, where what happens is Roman Catholicism comes in and tries to evangelize, and all of the slaves in the New World who brought a lot of their animistic and their other kinds of ideas, and they rename these different entities and spirits in names of the saints and demons, but they're still trying to use the ideas that they've had from their past paganistic practices to say these are beings that can be controlled, and we can use spells to affect the way the world works. Well, and I think even today, right? I mean, that's witchcraft, and in essence, is there is a power out there that we can, through proper incantation, in some way affect and make changes.
So I think there's two things going on in the lead up to the 1400s, and actually it starts a little bit earlier with I think it's Pope John the 22nd in the beginning of the 14th century, who writes a document about witchcraft that then becomes formal teaching of at least the Vatican, out of the Holy See at that time. So you have the development of Christian theology, which starts to see and identify remnant pagan practices through a biblical worldview, right? That these are actually expressions of some kind of worship of, let's just say, worship of Satan, right? The devil. But, and this is something that sociologists more recently, like Eliade, have pointed out, all human cultures have some form of witchcraft, some form of magic use, right? And that's not. It's common to in ancient Asian cultures and pre-modern African cultures. You mentioned the pre-modern island cultures that the Spanish Catholics came across. So paganism, being kind of the default religion of man, always has some kind of magical practices, right, associated with it.
Yeah, that's human nature.
That is, which we could call witchcraft. I mean, that
Yeah.
the term
I
comes
mean,
along later, but it's basically magic use, right? It's the use of magic, the conformity of natural circumstances to the magician's will, either through, possibly invoking some other spirit beings, for sure, or through the spells and incantations that set themselves, or elixirs or talisman, charged objects, etc. So so there are common practices amongst all pagan cultures that would have carried on in certain European cultures in the form of low magic, sorcery, tying bed knot, what the Enlightenment thinkers will later call superstition, right? Which will actually get weeded out by science, by the natural sciences, as superstition and sort of like this stuff. And I think so that's what you're getting then is when, as the doctrine of the church develops and the church starts to focus more on a theology of demonology in the Middle Ages. And there are these sort of common pagan practices that continue in the culture. That would be that's sort of one explanation for why you get one explanation for the witch craze phenomena that happens.